Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced. And again, if you've been enjoying these videos, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment, and follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. But on that note, in the last couple of videos, we've been setting up our environment. So we set up Dremio, we've set up Nessie, we've set up Minio, we've set up Python, we've set up DBT, and we created our DBT project. Now let's actually see DBT at work. So let's actually use the models that come in a default project. So if you see here again in the models folder, we have our example folder, and essentially again each of these, basically these SQL files or SQL files, are what's referred to as a model. And the basic idea is this: when you run a model, the output of that model ends up becoming whatever you said it is. In this case, see how this config function, and you notice these curly brackets. So if you ever use like Django or Flask and created like templating with a language called Jinja, that's essentially what this is. These are Jinja templates. So essentially what you're doing is you're calling on different Python functions that are part of the DBT library within these Jinja templates. So essentially you're templating your SQL in the same way you can template a website. And essentially what this config function does, it can change how that particular model is treated. So by default, if I don't include this, so like if I were to just remove this, it's just going to follow the settings of my DBT project. Okay, so again, in my project, I said, hey, anything in the example folder, we're going to materialize this as a view. So it's just going to create a couple of views. It's going to create a view called my first DBT model, and then here basically there's another one called my second DBT model. So let's actually walk through the SQL. So here we're using a common table expression. So what this does is that it creates a table called source data that is just basically select one as ID, union null, select null as ID. So essentially it's creating two rows, one as an ID, null as an ID. Okay. Now in this case, what's basically the actual query is select star from that. So basically those two rows become my first DBT model. Okay. And so that's the first model. And again, it's going to create a view called my first DBT model. Whatever the name of the file is what it's going to create. And then the second DBT model, you'll notice that there's another Jinja function called ref. What ref does, it says, hey, this model, so in this case, the table here, the table that I'm selecting from, is this technically the result of this model that's also is part of this project. So that model has to run first. Okay, so that's how DBT orchestrates. Because since each model can reference other models, it knows which order it should run those models. So in this case, it's like select star from that model, and it's only going to choose the one where the ID is 1. Okay, so let's actually run these models. And then there's a schema.yaml. A schema.yaml is optional, but essentially what it does is it allows you to kind of create constraints. So you can actually take a model. So in this case here, we say my first DBT model. I can write some documentation on it, like description, and I can describe the columns that it should have. And I can actually write some tests on that model. Okay, so then in that case, you could, well, it'll just check for those things. So we'll leave it at that. Okay, so now if I run DBT run, okay, what that's going to do is going to run those models. Okay, so there it's going to go. So what it's going to do is going to use the details in the profile that we created to connect to the data source, and then it's going to begin running this SQL, and then taking the output of that SQL and creating a view. And it will know how to do that because each DBT adapter is created for that particular tool. So see, it did all that successfully. So now if I go back to Dremio, and again, we specified in our profile that it's in DBT practice, output test 1, and see, we see our two models there. And if I scan the first model, okay, see there's the 2 rows, because again, the 2 rows, and then in the second one should only have 1 row. So let's go check out the second one. So DBT practice, output test 1, my second DBT model, I run it, and there we go. We see that it's just 1 row. Okay, and that was created is really a view of the original. Okay, now again, that data did not exist, so it did have to be materialized into a table. So if I go over here, we specified that if it were to materialize a table, it should do it here in output test 1. So if I go in here, or is it in the other one? Actually, I don't think it did, because technically the SQL actually does materialize it, the common table expression. But now let's go back And if I go back and I add that function back in, okay, oops, not that. Okay, so if I were to go add that function back in, so I would just say, hey, config, and then say, hey, materialized equals table. Okay, so now what's going to happen is that's going to change this job, and it's actually going to say take the result of this and create a table from it in the object storage source. Okay, so in the Dremio, when we did that configuration, remember we did an object storage source and a space. The space is where the views are going to get saved to, and you'll see that it'll materialize a table in the object storage source. So if I run this again, so again, I can change how this particular model gets treated using these config functions. Okay, so if I do dbt run, okay, it's going to run it, complete it successfully. Now if I examine it, okay, dbt practice, again, those are going to be in the same place. But if I go to my warehouse, I go to output, I go to test one, or was it like house? Output, test one. Maybe they didn't detect that. Finish. Oh, because I didn't spell it right. Materialized table. Okay. Cool. So let me try that again. So we run it again. So this time materialize should be spelled correctly. So it now should do what we told it to do. Okay, and see right there now, yeah, there it is. See, it's creating the SQL table in warehouse output test, so you can read the output to kind of see what it's doing. So now if I go to the warehouse, I go output test one, there it is. See, created and materialize the table. So that config materialize command allows us to kind of change, hey, is it creating a table or is it creating a view? Okay. Now if I want to change where, so if I take that back out again and I say, okay, I don't want to do that. But let's say I wanted to change where the view is being created, okay, or the table is being created, either way. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another space. So I'm going to say, okay, I want another space. We'll call it dbt practice 2. Okay, and I am going to create a folder in there called output. No, not a new view. Leave. I want to create a new folder called output. And in that folder, we'll create another one called test1, just kind of keep on with the same. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in that config function again. Except now we're going to do a little bit differently. Now, again, another thing I want to do is I want to add in dbt practice. I'm going to add a folder called test2. New folder called test2. And that'll be that. So in this case, let's say first off, I want to stick to the same space, but I wanted to create in that test2 folder instead of test1. Okay, then what I would do is I would change the schema, because the schema is the sub path. So I'd say, hey, the schema this time around is going to equal test2. So within dbt practice space, I just want to materialize that view or create that view in the test2 folder. So now if I run this, let's see how that goes. And that's going to be successful. And now let's see here that it created in the different locations. So if I go to dbt practice.2, I open up output. First go here and we go to test2. And there it is. It created the model there because I configured it. So by default, it'll always do it where we configured it in our profile, but I can change that. Now, what if I want to move it to the other space? So I want to move it to the dbt practice2. Okay. Well, then what you do is you specify a database argument. So in this case, this would be dbt practice2, comma, and then this would be like, okay, I want this to be in output dot test1. Okay, and now if I run this, and there we go. Okay, so what we have done successfully is create that model, and now we should have created it in a different space. If I go here, the dbt practice.2, output test1, and there's my model. So you can see here from this project, I can design my whole semantic layer and make sure I put all my views in the right places to create the desired sort of semantic layer and organization for my views. And the cool thing is you'll be able to rerun them anytime you make changes to them to create to update them. And we'll do that. We'll do a whole example sort of in the next video. So I'll see you there.